Both Vice President Harris and former President Trump have very different approaches to foreign policy as the election draws closer. Joining us right now with a look on what these policies might look like is Mike Gallagher, Palantir head of defense and former Republican representative for Wisconsin. Good morning to you. I'm curious, actually, if somebody was at a cocktail party with you and said, what do you think the distinctions on foreign policy are? Just straight up, what you actually think they would be, if you were in a sentence.
I think a much stronger military deterrent under Trump, a much more hawkish approach to China. And that is really, I think, where the biggest difference emerges. The Biden administration started off with a lot of continuity with Trump's China approach. And about midway through the administration, they shifted and they engaged in this sort of intense diplomatic rapprochement. They sent every major cabinet official to China in an attempt to turn down the temperature. I think you can expect a much more aggressive approach on China in a Trump administration. And I think his cabinet on national security would largely be populated with sort of Reaganite national security, you know, speak softly, carry a big stick kind of hawkish.
Who do you think would be part of his cabinet? I mean, that's a big question.
Yeah, I think Secretary of Defense, the names you hear, Tom Cotton, Mike Pompeo, Mike Waltz, Robert O'Brien. I think for Secretary of State, Bill Hagerty, Robert O'Brien as well, John Ratcliffe at CIA. I mean, these are all very serious, smart, aggressive people. I think that would be a fantastic team. And I hope Trump and the Trump transition team takes a look at all of them.
Steve Leisman was talking earlier about tariffs and really talking how even bipartisan, as opposed to economists on a bipartisan way say that these tariffs turn into taxes on the American people. Do you agree with that?
Well, tariffs do come with costs. I think you have to make a distinction between the 232 tariffs, which I had opposed. These were the steel and aluminum tariffs. I think it was an exaggeration of the intent of the law. We don't have a national security threat from Canadian steel and aluminum, but I thought the 301 tariffs that Trump put in place and Biden largely kept in place were a good piece of work and highly justified. I think that gets to a broader economic dynamic. As we have a more intense or antagonistic relationship economically with China, we're going to have a proactive, positive trade agenda with other parts of the world. And we need to break down barriers to economic cooperation within the free world.
So you would be in favor of tariffs on China, but not necessarily on our allies?
No, I think we should actually expand our partnerships with our allies. I think we should look for digital trade agreements with our allies.
He's not talking about that, though. A free trade agreement with
Taiwan, a post-Brexit gold standard trade agreement with the UK.
But he's not talking about that. He's talking about putting a 200% tariff on deer. You know, if they move some of their stuff to Mexico.
I suspect President Trump, as was the case during his 4 years in the White House, is using a lot of this as a negotiating tactic. We'll see. He doesn't have an opportunity to kind of pull, and Nixon goes to China on trade in certain areas. The one thing I would say is that for all the talk about economic policy, which is very important, if we don't fix our military, if we don't fix our hard power investments, none of the rest of it is going to matter. And there we have a massive problem with our defense industrial base. Our stockpile of critical munitions has gotten dangerously low. You have a smart audience, right? They look at numbers all day. They're looking at correlations. They're doing pattern recognition. There's an almost perfect correlation between the stockpiles of critical munitions and peace and stability in the world. The reason we see Xi Jinping this week going to Russia for the BRICS summit with Putin, the reason this is the closest relationship between world leaders on the global stage today is because they sense an opportunity to displace America as the world's sole superpower because our military deterrent.
Can I ask you a question about that, though? Do you think that under the Trump administration, 2016, 2020, from a budgetary perspective as it relates to defense, that he did anything that you would say was helpful to either reducing costs, helping the Defense Department, that is somehow different than the Biden administration?
Well, I was on the Armed Services Committee during those years, and what usually happened is the Defense Department submitted a budget that was insufficient, and I criticized the Secretary of Defense and Trump at the time, and then we, in a bipartisan fashion, would have to overrule that. And we did actually increase defense spending, but all we did was put a down payment on fixing readiness issues that were the result of the defense sequester under the Obama administration. What we didn't do was actually rebuild the Navy. We didn't transform the Fourth Estate. We didn't modernize the software that the military uses. That's what we do in Palantir in my day job right now. We didn't do the transformative things that will be necessary in order to bend the cost curve, rebuild our shipbuilding industrial base in particular, and maximize maximize production of critical long-range
And do you think he would
precision
somehow
fighters.
do that this time? And why would he do it this time?
I think it would
and not
depend
that time?
entirely on the team that he puts in place. If you look at the history of the Reagan administration, for example, it required the president backing a very talented Secretary of Defense, a very talented Secretary of the Navy, and they then had to go to war with their own bureaucracy in order to produce the 600-ship Navy. If you read Gates' memoirs, he had to go to war with his own bureaucracy to field the MRAP, which I was the beneficiary of when I was downrange in Iraq. It's going to require that same level of presidential leadership combined with talent in the form of a Secretary of Defense who's willing to push the bureaucracy to actually transform.
And to this day, Reagan is criticized for spending too much money on defense. And
well, he won the Cold War, so that's
what
not
I mean.
a bad
But there are
record.
certain things that you need to, as opposed to things that you spend money on that are absolutely useless.
You know, part of the problem, too, is the military is a microcosm of the rest of society, which is to say the money is largely not going towards the tooth, the weapon systems, what actually enhances lethality. It's personnel costs, right? It's healthcare, it's retirement. It's the same thing that's happening with the rest of society. Healthcare, retirement costs are consuming everything, and that's largely mandatory spending. That doesn't even get congressional review every year. That is the fundamental problem we need to fix, but neither party has exhibited enough willingness
fixing
or
by
courage to
cutting
fix
down
it.
the numbers of people in the military, or fixing by cutting the benefits? That you
I think you could first attack the largest branch of the military, which is not the Army, it's DoD civilians. Over 800,000 people. I think with advances in AI, we have an opportunity to automate a lot of those functions and reinvest it in the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Marine Corps. By the way, the entire acquisition workforce is larger than the United States Marine Corps.
Would you like
Elon
Elon Musk to take a look at these?
I actually find what Elon is talking about extremely compelling, and I've had disagreements with Elon on Twitter Spaces about his views on China, but the SpaceX story is one of the most remarkable and inspiring in recent years. Him going out there and talking about.
Do you think he would
cutting.
figure out the Defense Department? Piece of this. You want them to invest in innovation. And also, I would imagine, well, you don't want them to cut the budget. He wants to cut the budget.
No, I think...
I don't know if he wants to cut the defense budget, but he wants to create efficiencies.
Yeah, my overall view is that you can cut butter or certain aspects of the welfare state and invest that in a robust military deterrent. And you want a defense budget that at least keeps pace with inflation. But there is a lot of room for savings within the defense budget. The property, the Navy owns a bunch of golf courses and hotels that it doesn't need to own. It takes $15 billion a year, $10 to $15 billion a year, goes unspent. Congress appropriates the money to the military, and then it goes unspent, and it just goes into abeyance for 5 years and then back into the Treasury. Use that. Give them the flexibility.
What job do you want? What job do you want in the Trump administration?
My wife's going to give birth to twins in a month, so I will not be taking a job anywhere other than as a father.